Welcome to RareOnAir, the monthly podcast from EURORDIS Rare Diseases Europe. I am your host, Julien Poulain, and once a month, we will be exploring the challenges, experiences, and successes of people who live with a rare condition. In today's episode of RareOnAir, I'm thrilled to speak with Zainab Alani, a medical student at the University of Glasgow in Scotland and a passionate advocate for people living with rare diseases. Zainab began experiencing symptoms of her rare condition, myasthenia gravis, at 15 years old. Despite her mother, a general practitioner, suspecting the condition early on, Zainab faced a challenging journey to a diagnosis, marked by medical professionals' dismissiveness and even contempt. The story that Zainab shares with me highlights major deficiencies in healthcare systems that are all too often experienced by people across Europe who live with rare diseases. Her story also underscores the critical role of family support and the cultural and educational shortcomings that exist within healthcare systems when it comes to how they deal with and treat patients in need. We explore Zainab's experiences, the emotional toll of her diagnostic journey, the importance of family support, her transition into advocacy, and finally, her compelling mission to drive change in rare disease awareness with a focus on intersectionality. Zainab, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, Zainab, when did you first start experiencing the symptoms of what would eventually be diagnosed as myasthenia gravis?
Yeah, so I began experiencing symptoms just after my fourth year in secondary school exams. So I was about 15 and I vividly remember sitting in front of the TV and I was pushing my head back to try and keep my eyelids open, but I wasn't noticing. And my sister just said, "Why have you got your head so far back?" And at the time, I didn't think much of it, but it then got to points where I was, say, on the computer or on a laptop, and I was also just cocking my head back, trying to keep my eyes open some way. And it was just these little things that started to add up. And my family started getting concerned when I'd wake up at about 10 a.m. And I was so tired. I was waking up late and I just didn't have the energy that a 15-year-old should have. And I'm extremely fortunate that my mum is a general practitioner. So in the UK, that's a doctor who just has a very general coverage of lots of different types of medicine. And she's the one who thought this could be myasthenia. So from the start, I was very lucky that I had my own advocate there who put these symptoms together. But really, it was that just overwhelming fatigue and what we call ptosis, so the drooping eyelids. And it really started off so subtly with just having really droopy eyelids. And if you didn't have any medical knowledge, you probably wouldn't think much of it, just like I didn't until my mum picked up on it.
But I understand that during your diagnostic journey, there was lots of doubt there and dismissiveness.
Yes.
That's quite surprising, especially given the fact that your mother had what would turn out to be accurate suspicions as to what your condition was. What were those instances of dismissiveness like? What form did they take? And if your mother hadn't suspected it was this condition, do you think your diagnostic journey would have been much longer?
So as you're saying, I'm certain the diagnostic journey would have been longer. As I mentioned, I'm extremely fortunate, and the average time, as I'm sure yourself and many of our listeners are aware, is 4 to 5 years for the diagnosis. And I remember after getting diagnosed and seeing one of the third consultants, they told me if you hadn't been picked up when you were, you likely would have needed to be on a ventilator, because at that point, my voice muscles were becoming weak and I had really nasal speech. So I definitely could have been in a very much different position. But as you say, dismissal was no less having my mum there. I remember at the start we went to see my own GP, who just said, "Oh, she's probably really tired. She's just had her exams." And when my mum explicitly brought up the topic of myasthenia, he said, no, she's too young. No one with myasthenia is 15. And he said it with such confidence and such assurance. He had no doubt in himself. And then it got to points where we'd go to A&E, and there was one of the younger and more junior doctors was concerned and took my mum's concerns on board. And she went to refer my case to one of the myasthenia consultants. And she came back to us and said, "Myasthenia consultant isn't going to come see you because he doesn't think you have it." So this was an alleged professor and professional in the field of myasthenia who heard my case over the phone. I had all the signs. I had the double vision. I had the droopy eyelids. I was very tired and I fit all the boxes. Young, my mum had an autoimmune disease, and yet he refused to see me. I remember someone also telling me in the A&E department that it was likely my time of the month. I remember someone calling me, just saying I was a teenager and I was having to take time out of school for these appointments. And someone said, you must be enjoying that you're not in school at the moment. And they all thought I was just trying to take time off. And it took so long to reach someone who actually said, you know what, I think your mum could be right. But by the time it got to that point, I'd had a lumbar puncture, which was a needle in the spine. I'd had brain MRIs because they thought I could have a brain tumour that was causing my double vision and my headaches. But no one really considered that all these extra symptoms could be due to my myasthenia. They said there's too much going on for it to be myasthenia. I've never seen a case like this. And I think it's that problem that people think we're all textbooks. They'd never seen someone my age. So they said, she doesn't fit. And that's the problem. I think people are so rigid in their thinking that they're not willing to think outside the box.
Those sound like really, really infuriating experiences. Do you have a theory as to whether or not it's a cultural problem or an educational problem, or do you think it could be something else? Like, what leads to this dismissiveness, do you think, fundamentally?
I think it's definitely an educational problem. Having a foot in both worlds, so to speak, as a medical student and a rare disease patient, I've seen both sides. And in medical school, there's a phrase that when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. So they're basically saying, think common things and don't really think about the rare disease things. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm just saying that even though rare diseases are individually rare, together we are collectively common. And I think it was also being told by someone else they didn't really want to accept that they never picked up on the disease. Maybe it's that many people know that some doctors maybe want to be right a lot and don't like to be told what the condition is and maybe don't like to be told by patients. I've realised as a student, when a patient tells me something, they are the expert and I will listen. But the sad thing is some doctors don't realise that. And I think it is something we're trying to change within a rare disease society that myself and my sister Fatima founded. We're trying to change that mentality, and we are doing things and we're making change, because even in the medical school, we're now seeing more mention of rare diseases in exams and more highlighting of them in topics. And I think it's those small things that when people start seeing it in education, they take a value in it, because if it's not assessed, I know medical students will just turn a blind eye to it. So it's quite sad, really, that medical schools and medical education have probably quite a detrimental role to play in the rare disease world. But if we change that for the better, it really could make a huge impact on rare disease patients' lives.
No, absolutely. That's really important work. It's really positive, actually, to hear that there is genuinely more teaching of rare diseases as well as more like exam questions. So that's really positive, and well done on that work. Eventually, you did receive a diagnosis.
Yeah.
What were your emotions like when you did receive a diagnosis? Did you feel vindicated, or did you feel apprehensive maybe about the future now that you had it confirmed? And also, if I may tag on to that question, how do you describe myasthenia gravis to someone who may not have heard of the condition before?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just talk a bit about my diagnosis, because that in itself was also not ideal. I remember this day so vividly. So it was the 14th of June, it was a Friday, I'd come home from school and I was trying to get my homework out of the way before the weekend started. I was almost done. I remember so explicitly, it was a French essay I was writing for sports, which was actually quite also in itself quite difficult because I hadn't been able to do sports because of my myasthenia. So I was writing this essay and I got a call and I picked it up, and it was one of the consultants who'd also not believed that I had myasthenia. And she said, "Is this Zainab?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "This is Dr. So-and-so." And I said, "Yes, I remember you." And she said, "Remember that blood test we did for myasthenia?" I said, "Yeah, of course." The one my mum had asked for. She said, "Yeah, it's come back and your antibodies are 500 times what they should be. So you do have myasthenia. You can come and pick up medication on Monday." And it was a at max 2-minute, 1-minute phone call. And I didn't know what to do with myself. And not long after, my mum came home, and I'd always go and open the door to my mum. And she looked at me and she said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I just got told I have that diagnosis." And I was really happy. And I could see this look on my mum's face. And she just looked so distraught. And my dad came home shortly after. And my mum was she was so upset but so angry that I'd gotten this diagnosis over the phone, because they hadn't called her, and I was only 15, so I should still be in the eyes of the NHS under paediatric care. And even though I was mature, I do not believe I should have been given that diagnosis over the phone alone. And when I got called to an appointment with a consultant, it was that consultant I mentioned who'd refused to come review me. It was that very man who ended up being the first consultant I saw. And I remember sitting on the chair and with my hands under my legs, feeling really nervous. I never play with my hair and I didn't know what to do. And he said, "Stop playing with your hair." This consultant was so really just, in his words, derogatory, dismissive. And I remember my parents are very strong people, and I just saw them in the corner of the room crying. And that's when I knew that there was something serious about this diagnosis. But as you said, it's a Latin word, myasthenia gravis. Whatever could that mean? And it literally translates to grave muscle disease. And back in those days, people would just die with myasthenia because they didn't know what was causing it. And eventually your body would get the better of you and your muscles would fail and your lungs would fail. And then unfortunately, patients would die very young. So that's where it got its name. But it's basically a rare disease, and it's autoimmune, which means the body attacks itself. It creates little what we call antibodies that go off and attack the muscles, and it really attacks all the muscles in your body other than your heart and your gut. So they're saved. They're saved from this, luckily. But it means every time you move, whatever you do, you just get weaker and weaker with each movement. And it's, I wouldn't say life limiting because that makes it sound like you could get a shortened lifespan, which you don't. But it is limiting in the aspect that you can't do everything that you would want to do. I was quite active. And the minute I got that diagnosis, my whole life, and it came to a complete halt because I had to relearn my boundaries, relearn what my body could do.
The stories you've told, though, about how the diagnosis was delivered to you and the follow-up care are really atrocious. And also reflecting again on the story about you receiving the phone call with your diagnosis, I'm surprised by how often I have heard that story across the community. Lots of families impacted by a rare disease across Europe seem to have that story of receiving a very flippant and quick phone call where they first learnt about the diagnosis of themselves or their child. May I ask then, so you do mention some medications. What is the state of healthcare for myasthenia gravis, and are there any treatments for it currently?
So I think the thing about a lot of rare diseases, and especially autoimmune diseases, is everybody knows that the first thing you do is you get in there and you try and calm down the immune system that is going crazy and attacking the patient. And the part I hate most about my whole journey is when I was on steroids. So people, when they think of that, they think of people going to the gym, bulking up. But the doses I was on really high doses. And I remember it went up within matters of days. So I started off at 5 and then they put me to 10, 15, 20, all the way up to 40 a day, which was quite a lot. And I remember the worst part of it all was the side effects that I got. So for people who've not heard of steroids or people who've not been on them, if they're lucky enough, you get hair loss, you get weight gain, you get moon face, you get acne, you get everything under the sun, you get mood changes. And I remember I was at probably the worst time to have been on those medications. I was in secondary school and people know what girls can be like. And I got some pretty horrible comments, people saying, "What's wrong with your face? Have you had an allergic reaction?" Because my face was just a big bowling ball, basically. I used to have what they call plethoric face. So I was red all the time, even if I wasn't warm. And it just was a horrible time in my life. I've had multiple relapses along my 5 years, and every time I've been offered to go back up on my steroids, and it's one of the things that I will never agree to. I said, unless I'm on a ventilator and I have no free will of my own, I will not willingly choose to go up on them, because I hated the person I was, not because of just how I looked, but because of how I felt. When I was on steroids, I never felt so low, and I never knew until I came off them that was why I was feeling that way. And it was these medications that are so powerful to change how you're feeling and make you feel so horrible. So I'm still on them, but thankfully on a much, much lower dose that doesn't have those impacts. But I also got put on immunosuppressants, and they have their own risks. So it's kind of a double-edged sword where you take on these side effects. And I think that Big Pharma is finally realising that this is a lucrative field, and there are medications being developed. And I was put forward for a new medication, and it got taken to a panel where they would see, but I was rejected. And that's a case with a lot of patients where there are these new medications and new treatments available, but it's just not accessible to everyone at the moment, but it could make a huge difference to the lives of patients because, yes, I am stable, but I still have symptoms that impact my daily life. So even though I'm stable, I am still not living my life how I used to. So there are new treatments on the horizon. You'll hear amazing studies and medical studies, but these are often people who've been accepted into the trials, and that in itself is difficult to get into. I remember at one point I was so desperate that I was willing to go into a trial and just wanting to try medication, but there was so much inclusion and exclusion criteria that I just couldn't get in. It's up to each consultant. So my consultant, for example, isn't keen to try some medications because it creates too much of an up and down in my treatment, and she'd rather I be stable. And I've been waiting for a while for a new treatment, and even though it came around, I've just not been able to use it yet.
Yeah. Now, I imagine you must have been quite disappointed not to be accepted on the trial. How did that make you feel?
Yeah, it was really disappointing. I waited 6 months, and I was really sure that I'd get this. I'd prepared, I'd thought it all out. I spent a lot of time deciding, and I knew that this medication didn't have a lot of knowledge about it. And I was willing. It took a long time, but I decided I was willing to accept the side effects if it would make me be able to get to that Zainab that I once was. And then I got a letter in the post, and it was explained to me that they weren't keen to accept me because I hadn't exhausted other options. Each trial does come with side effects, and I'm not oblivious to the side effects I've accepted over time. I got an infusion to try and limit my side effects at the time, and it just made me prone to every infection under the sun, and that was during COVID. So I became severely unwell when I did catch COVID. And I remember my myasthenia went very quickly from ocular, which is just affecting the eyes, to generalised. And I had a thymectomy surgery that got moved forward 6 months because of how severely unwell I was getting. And I'd accepted all the risks, and I'd hoped that this would be my cure. I'd heard of many people at the start of their diagnosis, if they got the surgery quick enough, they were better. But the surgery didn't work for me. 5 years on, I've still not really found a benefit from it. But I got nerve damage because when my nerves healed after the surgery, something went wrong. So there's all these side effects that mean taking more medication to deal with the side effects of some other thing. And it's just one of those things that I guess we have to accept if we want to, just survive, because I know that if I didn't take these medications, I would relapse to a stage where I would likely need to have a breathing machine working for me. So it is really difficult. But I just have to keep going. It's one of those things where I have to accept that it'll be difficult, but I can't stop, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. It's interesting. A diagnosis clearly did have a big impact on the medical care that you received. Even if for better, I imagine that would have required lots of readjustment as well, having to be on such a comprehensive regimen of different medicines. I read, though, I think upon you receiving a diagnosis, you had kept your diagnosis private for 3 years. So am I correct in understanding that much of the outside world would not have been aware of your condition? And what was it that informed that decision over that almost 3-year period?
Yes, that's correct. It was a really difficult time. And I think the major driving force was that I was in denial. I didn't want to accept that I had this. And I think I thought at the time that if I didn't tell people, it would just go away. And I remember I just kept it between my mum, my dad, and my brother, my sister, because they were the only people I needed. And I just had this amazing support network in my family that I think as I was learning about myself, they kind of just created that bubble while I was still rediscovering who I was, because it was really, even though it was hard on me, I know how hard it was on them because they'd never seen me like this before. There was a whole new me that was being brought out through the medications. I wasn't myself. And I remember in school, especially after the pandemic, I had been shielding. So I had really just been cut off from the world. And I'd sit in a separate room because I was at risk of catching infections from other people. And I remember there was lots of judgment about why I was in this separate room, why I would have to go away, why is she wearing a mask? And there was a lot of judgment, and I think that had a huge impact on me. And I think that's why I do so much advocacy. I know at the time I wouldn't have had the strength or the bravery or the confidence, but now 5 years on, I now feel in that stage where not only can I speak for myself, but I can be that support for others. I remember last week I received a message from a mother of a girl with myasthenia, and she'd said the importance of my page had been to them and how they'd felt so disconnected and that they didn't have someone to talk to. And that's the kind of thing that keeps me going, knowing that I'm making an impact on people's lives, and that I got a message from someone who said, I was in school at the same time and no one understood, and now I've found your page. And it just fills me with really this feeling of joy and fulfillment that this is why I do it. And it just keeps me going on days where I don't feel up to it, or I feel a bit down or taken hostage by my myasthenia. Those days, it keeps me going.
Well, of course, that's really encouraging to hear. And also just the value of, I guess for many people as well, just being connected or aware of someone else who's going through what they're going through as well is in of itself a really valuable experience. So what was the moment exactly that you decided to go public with your condition, essentially? And what's your journey into advocacy been like?
Yeah, so it wasn't at all planned. I remember our medical school sends out a weekly bulletin, and it had this essay competition. And it was an essay competition ran by Student Voice Prize and Medics for Rare Diseases, who I give a huge shout out to because they are an amazing charity with amazing people. Lucy, Jo and Melissa are probably the people that kick-started my journey through that essay competition. I really did not think anything of it at the time. I wrote this essay and it really was cathartic for me. I got out all this anger that I'd pent up and built up at that time onto a page, and it just felt so good. And I sent away this essay and I really did not think about it one more time. And then I'd come out of anatomy one day and I got this email and it says, "This is the Student Voice Prize. You've won this competition. Please contact us." And I was like, is this a scam? And I showed it to my sister and she's like, "Didn't you enter this competition?" And I was like, I did, because it was still COVID. So it wasn't a prize in person. It was all on Zoom. And at the time, I actually didn't think that this would be the start of my journey. And I remember being on this call with Lucy, Jo and Melissa, and they were just these three people who were so passionate about rare diseases that it was so contagious. And I wanted to get involved. And I'm so happy that they caught me right at the start of my medical school journey, because at that time I was in two minds entering university. I said, I've got a new chapter in my life. I can tell people, or I can just keep going with what I've done. Just keep it to myself and no one will know. But I'm so glad that they got me at that turning point, because I decided I didn't need to hide it. And they empowered me to share my story. They gave me platforms. After that competition, I was really grateful to work with Beacon for Rare Diseases. And I only realised after speaking out that there were so many people like me in the same position of not knowing who to talk to, not knowing what to say. So I definitely owe it to the rare disease charities, because without that essay competition, I probably would have 5 years into my diagnosis still have kept it private.
So what was your essay on?
So my essay was on the topic that you were supposed to write around was intersectionality. And I realised there were lots of aspects of myself, my culture, my background that played into making my diagnostic odyssey probably a bit more of an odyssey. Probably my age, as I mentioned, people thought I was a female, just lazy. People thought my age, teenager. People thought being a young woman, time of the month. And then there's also that, it's not blatant racism, but micro discrimination. And people just, I think there's those times that would start off like an awkward consultation, so to speak. People would say, "Oh, your name, where are you from?" And I'd say Scotland. "Oh, where are you really from?" And there's these ways that, you approach topics like this. And there were really aspects of my whole personality, my whole being throughout it that I think all came together to make my journey more difficult than it should have been. But I realised that intersectional aspect of me was what made my story so unique. And when sharing it, again, that's the parts that people resonated with. I had messages from people who said, on terms of micro discrimination, that they said that their family had a history of likely some tropical diseases, and someone thought they could have tuberculosis because of their family origin. And people again saying that because of their age, they'd been dismissed as just being lazy. Again, a lot of females, again, being told that it was just part of being, getting older and becoming a woman. And it's just really sad to see. And I'm really, really happy that I shared those parts of me that I'm really proud to showcase and to see how they impacted my rare disease journey.
No, it's really interesting, and also to reflect on yourself as a case study where there are multiple intersections, I guess, if that's the right way of putting it, in terms of not just gender, but also age and also race, and how those relate to being a rare disease patient within healthcare systems. So as a medical student, do you believe that you've witnessed anything from almost like the other side of a healthcare system? Have you had any interesting emerging opinions or perspectives with regard to how healthcare systems address rare diseases or see rare diseases?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's a lot of that common things are common adage being thrown about medical school, and there are multiple times where I have emailed the head of the year or who organises the course to just tell them that this is really detrimental, and I've had discussions about why this is dangerous to the rare disease field. And when I'm on placement, I am unashamed of sticking up posters and advocating, and whenever I have the chance. And I think also I remember when I get to see patients, and you'd go to see the patient and you'd ask what's their condition, and they say, oh, it's just a rare disease, you won't know it. And it's really sad to see that they know that students have this disregard for rare conditions. And I remember speaking to another patient, again, where race and intersectionality was difficult in her case, and they'd refused to give her pain medication because of her race, and they'd incorrectly and racistly correlated her race with addiction. And I was speaking to her about her journey, and she was, again, she'd been in pain for so long, and just sitting there, and she said, oh, it's just a rare disease. And I asked, what rare disease is it? And when you ask that, it's just that simple question that they're not used to being a follow-up. But when you give them that opportunity, there's a whole world and wealth of knowledge that students could tap into if they just show the interest. And I think that's one of the saddest things I've seen on placement, is just this not even disregard among students, but even this feeling of self-deprecation, I guess, from patients themselves.
Oh, that's really interesting. So what are your main goals for the future as you progress in your medical education and career? And what kind of things do you hope to achieve or raise further awareness around?
I think one of my biggest goals at the moment is raising awareness for hidden rare conditions, because at the time, I guess if someone had medical knowledge and they'd seen me back when I was on my 40 milligrams of steroids a day, you could have maybe had a wee hint that something wasn't quite right, seeing how quickly I'd changed. But now if people look at me, you wouldn't know that I have myasthenia. There's so many things that people judge. And I remember once I was using a facility for people with disabilities, and I had an old lady who was shaking her head at me and this look of dismissal. And I just thought, what right does she have to judge people by what she sees? Because again, you don't know what's going on in people's lives. So I think that's my biggest mission at the moment, alongside, of course, rare disease advocacy.
No, that's interesting. And of course, yeah, combating some of the problems around that are experienced by people with invisible conditions is really important and something that resonates across the community. So my final question would be, what have you got upcoming in terms of your rare disease advocacy, and where can people follow your work or even support it?
Yeah, of course. So I run my Instagram page, The Myasthenic Medic, and that's where I post. Really, I try to post a raw, unfiltered view of my life as a myasthenia gravis warrior, because I think it's not only important to show the good side, but also the times where I'm not so good and the parts where I might feel judgment. I try to show the good, the bad, but also the highlights. I'm actually alive, which wasn't something myasthenia gravis patients could say before these treatments came about. And I think what I'm trying to do at the moment is just get involved wherever I can. I was extremely grateful for EURORDIS offering me the opportunity to be a young ambassador, and even being on this podcast, because I think it's these little things where you try and get out your story, even the personal parts of it. And it's just these things that I think bring together our community. So wherever I'm able, I try and share that on my page. And yeah, I'd love to see some of our listeners coming on to learn about myasthenia.
Well, absolutely. I'm sure they will. Zainab, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's genuinely been really interesting, and you've come with plenty of insights which resonate right across the rare disease community. In particular, your experiences too are ones that will resonate. Zainab, thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. It was lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You have been listening to Rare on Air, a EURORDIS Rare Diseases Europe podcast with me, Julien Poulain. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe so you can tune in next month to learn more about the world of rare diseases. Do you have any reflections from today's episode that you would like to share? Feel free to email us at rareonair@eurordis.org. We look forward to you joining us next month.